guess we're ready? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you who are joining us in person, but also to the audience who's watching online. My name is Mireya Solis. I'm the director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. And it's my great pleasure to co-host today's event with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, and in particular to team up with Jim Schaaf, the director of the U.S.-Japan Next Alliance Initiative. We have an important and timely topic to discuss today: the new landscape for economic security in the Indo-Pacific and the implications of that for U.S.-Japan relations. Let me offer just a little bit of a framing remark, and then I'll introduce our panelists. Let me put it this way. Growing geopolitical tensions, concerns over the weaponization of economic interdependence, and the ongoing technological revolution have had deep implications for the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing in many ways a paradigm shift. Across the region, we see the rise of economic security policies. Broadly speaking, these policies are guided by two main objectives: to protect against vulnerabilities, to not be the target of external pressure, but also to develop technological prowess, to develop advanced manufacturing. And there's a new term that has become quite used lately, and that is a strategic indispensability. And that, I think, guides a lot of the actions that we see from governments in the region. China has doubled down on its state capitalism model to pursue self-sufficiency in advanced manufacturing, has embraced civil-military fusion, and has relied on its market power as a tool to exert leverage with regional actors with which it has foreign policy disagreements. And we see this type of economic coercion more frequently. The United States, Japan, and other industrialized nations have responded by reviving industrial policies and building a defensive toolkit on cybersecurity, export controls, and investment screenings. Sometimes the actions of these countries are coordinated, but sometimes they're not. And there is no question that as we go into this new dynamic, we're going to see a reshaping of the regional economic order. So to assess all these trends, to understand how will they impact the policies of the United States and Japan, let me introduce the panelists in the order in which they will offer framing remarks. Jim Schaaf leads the U.S.-Japan Next Alliance and at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. And previously, he was Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy at the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense. Jun Kazeki is Executive Advisor at the GRIPS Alliance, focusing on economic security and emerging technology. Most recently, Mr. Kazeki served as Director General for the Trade Control Department at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, where he was responsible for export controls and investment screening. And before this role, he was involved in designing the growth strategy in the Cabinet Secretariat. Mihoko Matsubara is Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT and a non-resident scholar at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Previously, Matsubara-san worked at the Japanese Ministry of Defense, and the 2019 book on cybersecurity won an award by the Okawa Foundation for Information and Telecommunications. And Scott Kennedy is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS. He is a leading authority on Chinese economic policy and a prolific writer. Some of the recent publications include China's Uneven High-Tech Drive, Implications for the United States, and Chinese State Capitalism, Diagnosis and Prognosis, and most recently also a study of industrial policy in advanced technology, I think by the title of Red Ink, if I'm not mistaken. Great. So our speakers then are going to start with some framing remarks, and then I'll open it up for a conversation amongst the panelists, and then I want to bring the audience both in person and online and make this a very interactive process. And Jim, why don't you get us started, please, in talking about some of the broad trends, drivers, and what you see are the most important highlights. You want to understand what is happening in terms of economic security in the Indo-Pacific and U.S.-Japan relations.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Maria, for having us here, working with Sasakawa USA on this event, participating in our weekend retreat that we held in Annapolis just this past weekend with a delegation from Japan and from the U.S., from diverse backgrounds related to economic security. Many of the participants are here on the panel and in this room, and I'm grateful to their contributions as well. This was the first Next Alliance conference that we organized in our program. And the Next Alliance initiative is focused on helping the U.S.-Japan alliance think through and prepare for dealing with new and emerging trends, challenges facing the alliance. In particular, connecting people to help build the alliance infrastructure and facilitate policy coordination for the future. And one area of focus for us this year is to support the economic 2+2 in the alliance to help us navigate this new era of economic security. And my framing remarks will echo some of what Mireya talked about. In the 1990s, economic security was primarily about competitiveness, and the U.S., Japan, the EU all pursued this in the context of reducing barriers to trade and investment, and by inviting diverse partners like China to be a part of it and including them in the WTO and the like. And the U.S., Japan, and the EU, I think, were largely of one mind about this, but we had to negotiate the details, and that's what USTR and others all struggled with for many years, but worked it out. Now we're in an era of Brexit, U.S. withdrawal from TPP, unilateral tariffs, domestic subsidies, sanctions, and a raft of new export controls. But still, we have like-minded partners, and we are trying to develop new bilateral and multilateral arrangements to pool resources, create more resilient supply chains, and prosper together by forming circles of mutual trust. But it's not as simple, I think, as dividing ourselves into two major camps, decoupling along authoritarian and democratic lines, because ideologically speaking, I think it's a very complex and dynamic time for all of us. Liz Truss in the UK pursued a libertarian economic vision. Now Rishi Sunak pledges a Thatcherite approach. In the US, we have swung from Trump's America First approach to Biden's assertion that allies are America's greatest strategic asset. And we're only just beginning to find out what Prime Minister Kishida's new form of capitalism is all about and how it differs from Abenomics. And moreover, we talk about this in the context of strategic competition with China, even though the word competition suggests that we have some mutual understanding of rules and a form of officiating. I would say that it's more accurate to describe it as a form of unbridled competition, in which governments seem willing to justify whatever they can get away with. Now, that doesn't mean there are no boundaries or parameters for this competition, but they are unclear and they could be eroded further. And although we approach this competition determined to do so in partnership with friends and allies, we all have our own political circumstances and ideological framing. So our dialogue in Annapolis aimed to support our country's efforts to develop useful parameters for this competition, facilitate collective effort, and to help grow, innovate, and protect our economies. Again, we're largely of one mind about this, but now it's time to dive into the details, and that's what we tried to do over the weekend. Before we get into our discussion later on, and I'll end my framing remarks with one main highlight or impression that I took away from the weekend, which is that modern economic security places a very large burden on the alliance and multilateral infrastructure. We have to commit to strengthening and reshaping that infrastructure and associated human networks in order to deal with it. For example, on rare earth metals, we have to diversify supply and refining capacity, but at the same time, we also need to innovate away from dependence on this dirty industry by developing substitute materials. We will need new minilateral or plurilateral frameworks for export controls, kind of on the defensive side of things, and for data sharing for investment and innovation on the offensive side of things. We might restrict what some of our citizens can do with certain foreign countries or companies, but we also want to expand contacts and facilitate more interaction with others. So I think embassies actually will become a much more important part of this process going forward, because they are the most tightly knit interagency bodies that our governments have that share a united vision, mission. Economic security is going to become, I think, a more central part of each embassy's mission going forward, and that will be something else we can talk about later.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that overview of some of the important trends that we're going to be discussing. I think that one of the top-line messages I got from your remarks is what happens to a rules-based order in an era of unbridled competition. How can we find constructive competition with China? We don't want to see a complete decoupling. And how can we then coordinate with allies? We might have close alignment in terms of interest, but then, as you said, the devil is in the details, and there might be some differences in how different countries perceive a competition with China. And as I was mentioning in my opening remarks, we see many countries then boosting that defensive toolkit. Export controls have been the talk of the town, not only here, but in many capitals, especially as of October 7th, when the United States introduced 2 new important export control rules. And Kazeki-san, you are an authority on export control rules. There's a lot to cover on what is Japan doing, how do you see the United States move here, and I think that there's also discussions about reform to the multilateral export control regime. Is there an opportunity for a plurilateral system? So whatever you want to pick, please let us know what are your thoughts on this area.
Okay, thank you, Miria. And first of all, I enjoyed the over the weekend Annapolis discussion. That was very informative, and I benefited from that discussion regarding economic security policy. And actually, this topic is quite timely because national security strategy of the United States just issued last October, and Japan's version is finalizing towards the end of this year after 9 years absence. And then this new national security strategy will include economic security policy. So that is a very crucial moment right now. So today I would like to raise 2 issues. First, it's the economic policy, economic security policy in general. And secondly, it's, as Miria said, state of play of export controls on semiconductors. I think it's very under interest right now. The first issue of economic security policy of Japan, actually the vulnerabilities of supply chains are very clear after the sort of high-tech competition among big players, and COVID-19, and recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those are very challenging. And then Japan took a holistic approach or whole of government approach or a big picture approach. We do both protection policies and promotion policies, as Miria articulated. Protection policies also include export controls, investment screenings, and research integrities. And the promotion policies include the R&D for advanced technologies by public and private partnership with funding. And those policies are well articulated in our economic security policy statement. And most recently, we enacted the so-called Economic Security Promotion Act. The act passed last May successfully, and now it's the implementation stage. So the implementation is now on track. And the first 2 pillars, supply chain resilience and public-private partnership for R&D, those are on track this year. And those pillars were entered into force last August. And the most recent basic guidelines were by the cabinet decision, the end of September. And then in the supply chain side, we have 11 sectors nominated towards the end of this year. I mean, by the cabinet order. So next year we'll start actual implementation of 11 sectors, including, of course, semiconductors, batteries, and critical minerals. And in the side of the R&D promotion, we issued, Japanese government so-called Tech Vision. First version of the Tech Vision was issued last September. It included 27 subset of precise technologies or advanced technologies. For example, quantum sensoring or space constellations. So those are included. So now the funding will be done next year. So that's already started. So what are remaining challenges? I think first is the so-called security clearance system. We need a robust protection of confidential information. That is the first challenge. And second is the cybersecurity issue. I mean, the third pillar of the Economic Security Promotion Act includes the protection of core infrastructure of Japan, including electricity, gas, transportation, finance, and water, almost everything. And the implementation date is November next year, 2023. So next year is a year of the cybersecurity or core infrastructure. So that is the second challenge. And the third challenge is more broadly how can we protect rule-based trading system. In Japan, economic security policy in a broader sense include a growth strategy, a free trade, rule-based trading system. So we host the next year G7 summit, and we are promoting, of course, Quad, CPTPP, obviously, and IPEF recently. So there are many initiatives. So next year is another challenge for us to lead all aspects of trade liberalization, growth, and rule-based trading system. So I noticed one of them is the economic coercion. That is a very important issue right now, hot topic. So how can we deal with this? Perhaps I can touch upon later at the discussion this matter. And now, as opening remarks, I will touch upon the state of play of export controls. So that is perhaps key issue today, too. The first, I have to reflect my term. It's February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we started. I mean, we means Japan, United States, and the EU started the sanctions against Russia, which included export controls. At that time, we went beyond the normally internationally controlled items in the regimes. But we included basic semiconductors or normal computer devices or even advanced technologies such as quantum computing relating items. That went beyond the existing regimes. And we did only 1 month or 3 months. Normally, it takes 2 to 3 years to agree upon such sensitive items in an international regime, but this time it's only 1 to 3 months. Because we share the shared value or importance of the rule of laws and importance of territorial integrity. That is why we agreed upon very quickly and achieved the goal. And now the most recent measure by the United States, October 7th, is the semiconductor. Well, to me, it's such a long history, not this time, but it's a long history of the, trying to capture the issue of this, competition on high-tech issue. And of course, Japan prefers a plurilateral approach. Last year, under the cabinet decision, we had a mandate to go forward the multilateral or plurilateral framework of export controls, which are the concept to agree upon the particular items, choke point items, by countries which possess key technologies. So that is only 1, 2, 3, or 4 countries get together to have agreements and then introduce export controls, not export bans. So we control case-by-case basis sometimes. But anyway, so that is our basic stance. And this time, the U.S. measure is unilateral. But I understand the United States would like to expand it. So I assume that Japan and European colleagues are now examining very carefully the scope of items because it includes 150 pages of the U.S. document. And also its impact on industries and exporters. And thirdly, the aspect of the practice, because sometimes the export controls include a case-by-case licensing practices. So our goal is to have final result, final outcome that is the level playing field by exporters and the business people. So in that sense, we are working hard. So I don't say the timing or the scope, but at least we have a shared goal to keep the technology supremacy and deter the threat for us. So that is what I'm saying right now, but I should stop here because 5 minutes limitation, so I can pick up questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazuki-san, for providing, first of all, a comprehensive overview of Japan's economic security strategy, the law that was passed in the spring, the connection between economic security and trade diplomacy, which I think it's important to highlight. And then your very careful discussion about the export controls, that Japan likes plurilateral export controls, the U.S. latest measure is unilateral, but there's an ongoing conversation, and right. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic. Matsubara-san, I think your expertise on a critical topic of cybersecurity is really a great benefit to this panel. We talk about the digital transformation. Increasingly, economies are going to digital platforms, and this creates great opportunity but great risks. We're also in a situation where we don't have multilateral digital standards, and I imagine we don't have a broad base of broad cooperation to deal with cybersecurity threats. So I wonder if you can talk about the role of cybersecurity in economic security, what Japan is doing, what the U.S. is doing, and where do you see perhaps some areas of alignment or any other element on the cybersecurity arena that you think we should all be aware of?
Thank you. So because Kazuki-san already touched upon the importance of cybersecurity in Japan-U.S. economic security collaborations, but also in a broader sense, cybersecurity is so crucial in the economic security in the Indo-Pacific. Why? Because each one of you here today, or each one of you listening to this webinar, are always reliant on the digital infrastructure. We cannot think about our innovations or business operations without our ICT technologies or digital infrastructures. So it totally makes sense to provide good, resilient cybersecurities for our innovations, digital infrastructure, and also more broadly, national security and economic security. But as Mireya already said, we have huge problems because now we have more IT assets to support our business operations or national security operations. So we have a broader and a bigger attack surface from cyber attackers. So I see two major threats to economic security from cybersecurity perspectives. One is cyber disruptions or cyber sabotage by ransomware attacks or wiper malware attacks, because it can disrupt our supply chain, and because even if attacker only hits one specific country or one specific company, but cybersecurity doesn't consider about national borders or borders of organizations. So the damage caused by cyber attacks can spread through the borders of organizations, business sectors, and also national borders. And also the second threat to our economic security or national security is cyber-enabled IP theft or cyber espionage. Because if they steal our intellectual property data by cyber espionage, then it means that countries can have advantage over our intellectual properties without making any efforts. Well, they are making efforts to do cyber espionage, but they are not making efforts to create that technologies. So it means that our side, the victimized company or victimized country, will lose market competitiveness. And also in the worst case scenarios, actually we've seen multiple cases that go into the bankruptcy and caused by cyber-enabled IP theft. So what should we do? So I would like to propose two policy recommendations to not only to the Japan-US alliance, but also to the Indo-Pacific like-minded countries. So first one is to do cyber threat intelligence sharing. at the classified level and also unclassified level. And because Japan and the US have been deepening and expanding our great alliance, and we've been having already almost annual cyber dialogues to share cybersecurity intelligence. But we should also include our critical infrastructure companies into that framework to share cybersecurity intelligence. Because cyber attackers are not only after defense sectors or US federal government or Japanese central government, they are also after our manufacturing sectors and also critical infrastructure companies. So it makes sense for us to share cybersecurity intelligence not only between the government, but also between the industry and the government, between the two countries. And in the future, we should expand to Quad and also to the broader Indo-Pacific like-minded countries. And of course, we can do that at unclassified level, but sometimes if we do that only at unclassified level, we lose the context. So that is why we have to expand the security clearance system to cover the broader critical infrastructure companies so that we can include more companies to share sensitive intelligence. And my second policy recommendation is to do a joint cyber exercise, not only between the central governmental agencies or ministries, but also including the critical infrastructure companies. And actually, I firmly believe that Japan can play a really great role in this. Because Japanese NISC is a Japanese cybersecurity agency, and it has already 16-year experience to host a joint cyber exercise inviting civilian agencies and also critical infrastructure companies, almost 4,000 people every year. So why not expanding to invite Americans or other Quad members? Of course, we're going to have huge barrier, English language barrier, but we can overcome because, again, the cyber attackers don't care about our national borders, so we have to do it. And also, if we can do a better classified level of cybersecurity intelligence, then we can also include very sensitive scenarios based upon what we've been observing in our network so that we can test and share our concerns, but also best practices to help our resiliencies for the Japan-US alliance, but also for the Quad, and also for the free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matsuura-san. Those are really excellent recommendations. And another element from your remarks that I took away is that, when we talk about economic security, of course, how governments want to vis-a-vis one another, how they position themselves is important, but the role of the private sector is critical. And certainly in cybersecurity, the capabilities of critical infrastructure companies is an element that should be taken into account. And more broadly, I think that the boundaries between government regulation intervention and private market enterprise is also a topic that recurrently comes up in this topic of economic security. In the context of supply chain, usually it's more on the complaint side because companies do not want to be given the government sensitive information. But certainly that's part of the mix of what's happening here with these trends. And let me go to Scott. And you have a unique set of insights on China from your long trajectory, but also I understand that you spend a significant amount of time recently in China, which is rare these days. And I was hoping that you could give us a sense of how do you see China positioning itself, Beijing, how is it thinking of its own self-sufficiency goals, but also how it's reacting to these changes in economic security policies from the United States and other countries. What was the atmosphere like
Sure.
as you traveled in China?
Well, Maria, thanks for having me, and I'm really glad that that Brookings and Sasakawa Peace Foundation had put on this program and the conference. I'm sorry I wasn't there. It sounded like it was a great discussion.
You were invited. He was busy. He was busy.
Yeah. A genuine excuse. If I could have been there,
Yep.
I would have been there, 100%. I did have a chance to go to China in September and October for 7 weeks. I tried to go in April, and Shanghai lockdown stopped me. Didn't want to sit in a hotel for 5 to 6 weeks doing nothing. So in the spring, actually, I went to Taiwan, Korea, and Japan for 5 weeks, and that was a really good chance. I don't know if I did that in preparation of this panel, but it helped a lot for me to really understand how our allies and friends look at the U.S.-China relationship, look at technology, and where we agree, where we don't. And then I went to China, and the topic of this panel was front and center. Obviously, I was there on October 7th when these regulations came out, and Jim wasn't there, so they couldn't yell at Jim, so they yelled at me instead. No, actually, I had very good conversations with people about technology. We disagreed a lot, but people weren't disagreeable. I would say the conversations in Beijing and in Washington about economic security are almost identical, just mirrored. And I think I sense some differences between Washington and its friends. So let me show you why I think that. So I think the reason the things sound so similar in Beijing and Washington is essentially at the conceptual level, we see a purely zero-sum relationship between commercial interaction and national security in both places. The more we trade, the more we're interconnected, the more at risk we are in terms of national security. I think that equation applies in the Biden administration, in the Trump administration before, and certainly amongst the people that I interacted with in Beijing who are in government or scholars that work on this. In addition, there is a huge focus on whatever that technological gap or lead is and how to narrow it or expand one's advantage. And that relative position matters a lot. There's less emphasis in each place on their absolute position. So whether you're ahead 4-1 or 18-15 doesn't matter so much in both places. So how much you innovate is less important than that one is ahead or one catches up. That seems to be common in both Beijing and Washington. In addition, they both focus heavily on their own dependence on the other or on global markets, and very little on how the rest of the world is dependent on them. So it's mostly a one-sided look at the equation, and therefore, the more we're connected, the more we're at risk. I think that's true in both places. And then in terms of policy, both frame their policy choices with the exact same language to begin the sentence, which is, because the other side did X, we have no choice but to do Y. And I can't tell you how many dozens of times I heard Chinese say, 我们不得不, we have no choice but to. And how many times in Washington I have heard folks in every building down that direction, we have no choice but to. So very, very similar. And so they talk about the other side's weaponization of interdependence, et cetera. So it's very zero sum. And that really differentiates the U.S. and China from what I hear from our friends in the region. As my colleagues on the stage have already said, we have the same goals: maintain the advantage, ensure supply chain resilience, prepare for any eventualities. But how we get there, I can tell that there's lots of differences that we will either negotiate or force on one another in one way. So my sense is that there is not a view in the region that economic engagement and national security are purely zero-sum. That, in fact, in some ways, commercial engagement can strengthen one's national security. And you don't hear that here. And I think that's a huge conceptual difference. So you'll hear from companies and governments in the region that selling to China, selling high-tech stuff to China, increases their wealth and their income, which they put back into R&D that helps them innovate and stay ahead. They also have R&D programs in China or have Chinese in their countries helping them innovate and stay ahead. In addition, by having Chinese companies in their innovation ecosystems, that extends the Chinese companies' dependence on their technology. Because ecosystems or supply chains aren't actually like a line where every link of that chain is identically powerful. Typically, in almost every single one of these ecosystems, it's either the United States or its allies that are at the top of these hierarchies. These are hierarchies that are very difficult to break unless you come up with disruptive technologies. And so there's a sense that having China in these ecosystems is as important as whatever that gap is. In addition, by having them in your ecosystem, you get a tremendous amount of information. So if a Chinese company is not in your ecosystem, it's in a different ecosystem, you have zero information. And whether you are, you won't know actually how far ahead or behind you are if they're not in the ecosystem. So there's a whole, I'm not even talking about, McDonald's theory of peace and, where we are connected so we won't fight with each other. These are just very basic ideas about the potential complementarity of economics and national security. And so I think that there's another debate in the region, and it's actually a debate I heard in Beijing, is to what extent does restricting China from technology constrain it, weaken it, slow it down, versus how much does it propel it to go forward? And so are we, maybe this depends technology by technology, but in certain areas, what you may end up doing is getting a stronger China than you would have otherwise gotten through other strategies. I think the last question that we're debating amongst our friends is there anything that China could do that would make it so we would change our approach? Like, is this part of a long-term negotiation in which we would eventually say, China, if you do X, we will lower these export controls or investment restrictions? Or is this just, we assume, since China is not going to change, it's set on its course, which creates national security risks for us because of Taiwan or the South China Sea or overall power and wanting different types of international systems, that we're just set in this way. And I think that there is a conversation to be had. Do we want to make this part of a broader negotiation where we set out for China, hey, if you did something, we might invite you back into the family of nations in high tech or not? Anyway, well, I'm going to stop there.
Well, that was very insightful and helps frame the conversation that I want to now start. Because my first question, and mostly I'm asking the other panelists to also respond to your comments, because I think that central to this discussion is to flesh out whether the United States is going it alone or whether it will have the support of other countries who read the China challenge the same way and agree on the methods. And it's not obvious that the answer is a straightforward yes. I think that there's a lot of, the stakes are very high and there's a lot to decide. We keep talking about October 7th as an important decision, and I think it's important to clarify why. The way I read that very, very long export control rules, and I'm not an expert, and there's a lot of technical elements there, but it seems to me that the United States, and if you also think about the comments from Jake Sullivan 3 weeks before, is saying that we no longer care about keeping a relative advantage vis-a-vis China, but an absolute one. Because the civil-military fusion component of what China is doing creates very high risks if China acquires these advanced chips for AI and supercomputing. They can then easily be transferred to military applications. And this is different then from what has been done in the past. And I'm not sure. I do pay attention that there was consultation, but there was not a joint action when October 7th came. So what do we make of that? And if I try to think through some of the elements of how Japan may be responding to this or how other allies, I think that we should also take into account all the other reasons that Scott alluded to, that the benefits of perhaps keeping China in the philological ecosystem are important, but also there are asymmetrical costs of divorcing economically from China. And there's a recent study by a couple of economists that was published in the World Trade Organization where they did this big simulation. What happens if you have whole-scale decoupling, two global blocks, one US-led, one China-led? What are the welfare losses? And I think that by the year 2040, this economist estimated that the loss for the United States was 1% of GDP, the loss for Japan, 4%. I may be off in the numbers, but it tells you that there's a difference. Another element here that I'm putting on the table for discussion is that, yes, Japan and Korea and all the G7 countries joined together with these plurilateral export controls on the occasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it might be different when it comes to how you deal with the China challenge, because with Russia's action, it's black and white, right? They invaded a country, they're killing civilians, they're violating every possible rule we can think of. China has engaged in gray zone activities that don't rise to the level of military invasion and economic coercion. And China's a much larger economy, it would be much harder to isolate, and there would be blowback effects. So I'm trying to give you a lot of material to draw on, but how do you see this question as the U.S. redefining the terms of technological competition with China? Is it keeping its allies on the same front or not? Whoever wants to jump on that?
May I?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course. The first thing, the reaction to the Scott is a zero-sum game regarding the China-US. We see that it's not a zero-sum game. We don't use a word like decoupling. We as a government, we say that constructive and stable relationship with China is very important, while the allies is the United States. It's kind of a balance is here. And of course, we need a sort of strategic autonomy and indispensabilities. Those are the very important element of our economic security policy. So, but at the same time, we need to continue to our business. So that is the basis, of course. And in a sense, the unilateral nature of the measure by the U.S. would invite a Chinese reaction. That is the case. You said something like China is forced to do something. Only when U.S. do something, U.S. does something. So that escalation is not preferable for our perspective. That is why Japan is promoting a so-called plurilateral approach by like-minded countries. Of course, EU is one thing, even other countries which possess the technologies. So that is a kind of a third way to mitigate it. Of course, WTO is the best one, and also Western arrangement by 42 countries are a good way to have a consensus. However, due to the time, for the agreement by 42 members, it's very hard to catch up with the speed of the technology. You see the AI, semiconductors, and quantum; those are so fast. Therefore, U.S. struggled the last, I think, 7 years. After the military infusion policy of China 2015. So I think, to me, it's a kind of an ordinary course of business United States did this time, by tackling the lack of the sort of effectiveness of the current existing export control system. So therefore, under the Trump administration, U.S. started 2020, the very, very unilateral measures against China, including foreign direct product rule. But under the Biden administration, it's changed a little bit the course to have a close consultation with allies and like-minded countries. So there are some sort of differences between the two administrations, and we appreciate at least a close communication with like-minded countries, allies on this matter. So I think that there is a hope. And the Russian invasion is one thing, one example, because we did a very good coordination. And I agree with Mireya that China and Russia, of course, it's a completely different context. So we have facing a very big challenge right now. Back to you.
Thank you. Jim?
I'd like to add that there are also, I agree with the points that Kazuki-san is bringing up. There's also kind of technical legal issues at play, and those are some areas that we can actually address, I think, to get better at this in terms of how we coordinate. One is, for example, on this October 7th rule, the U.S. government was working apparently with U.S. industry folks who really know the details through non-disclosure agreements, because, of course, if news of this gets out in advance, it can move markets. There's all kinds of considerations on that front. So there were limits to how much they could engage in detail with the Japanese in developing the rule. And so I think some of Japan's and the EU's kind of hesitancy or waiting the gap in time frame is in part because they didn't know what the impact would be, and they didn't want to reserve judgment to kind of be able to analyze this. So we'll see how this plays out over time. The Commerce Secretary has already suggested that Japan and Netherlands will be coming on board, and we'll see that. And then the other issue is legal issues. Japan doesn't necessarily have the same authorities that the U.S. Government has to impose certain export controls on individual countries or particular products just for national security reasons. As a matter of fact, the U.S. is, as we look at economic coercion or countering economic coercion, we're beginning in the Congress to define that in the context of having measures that are rooted in law and transparency and accountability, et cetera, as some way to define what economic coercion is so that we can differentiate Chinese action from our own action. But if Japan doesn't have the legal mechanism to piggyback on a U.S. export control rule, what's the legal authorization or foundation for that decision? Does Tokyo Electron just say, I don't want to sell this to you, and because the U.S. doesn't want me to? China could then accuse Japan of entering into economic coercion. And so these technical and legal issues also have to be sorted out, in addition to trying to find that common ground, I think, where the U.S. may have to be a little less maximalist in its objectives to accommodate the perspectives, and I think that of its allies and other countries in the region.
Very interesting. I'm old enough that I remember when industrial policy was a bad word, and not anymore. And industrial policy used to create a lot of friction between the United States and Japan. And at least we don't seem to have that level of tension by any means. But I guess, let me put it this way. By competing with China, are we becoming like China or not? It seems that there's an element of emulation there. Perhaps the industrial policies pursued by China and other countries in the West are very, very different. But nevertheless, the numbers do jump at you, that governments right and left are throwing subsidies, investment incentives. Everybody wants to attract cutting edge or advanced fabs and other parts of the ecosystem of the supply chain in semiconductors and other industries. And this raises the question as to how we make sure that the money provided to nurture these industries is done in a disciplined, effective way. How do we avoid a subsidy war amongst allies? How do we avoid trade fights? Because these are subsidies that could then be called actionable under the WTO. And Scott, I know you had a report right on comparing industrial policy, so maybe I should go to you first, but then I welcome everybody's responses too.
Sure, thanks. In May, we tried to do some math on how much different governments around the world were spending on industrial policy. It's very difficult. Obviously, the Chinese are not very transparent. Their reports to the WTO are quite limited. But actually, it's hard to get numbers from everybody. We all have different definitions. There are different types of tools. And so trade tools versus tax tools versus finance, they're not all kept in the same place. So it's a mess. And luckily, young researchers and interns are plentiful in Washington. Otherwise, we'd never, ever get this thing done. But we did interact a lot with the WTO, the OECD, and others. And we found that China, in 2019, which is our base year for measure pre-pandemic, spent about 1.75% of its GDP. If you tweak the assumptions a little bit, you get up to 4.9%. So consider 1.7 something the bottom, 4.9% the top. Other countries that we put in the study, other economies, South Korea was the second at about 0.68%. I think Japan was about 0.45 or so, US 0.4. Brazil, another developing country, 0.33% of GDP. We tried to make it apples to apples comparison as much as we could, but of course, again, it's difficult. Now, we obviously, the US has, I think, at least conceptually shifted gears quite a bit. And it's going to, we would have to, I don't think we'll ever be able to catch up with the Chinese. And I don't think that we should want to say we've got an industrial policy spending gap that we need to try and catch up on, either individually or collectively. I mean, the Chinese do basically identify every technology under the sun as a priority, which means nothing is a priority, and they spend a lot. Also, their funding goes to politically allied companies, so mostly state-owned enterprises and private companies that have shown that they are on Team China. And they are very prescriptive about the technologies they want to win, and they don't do a whole lot of good bean counting at the end to see how effective it was consistently. So obviously, others, including Japan, Korea, Singapore, have used industrial policy, and sometimes they've wasted lots of money. And so there's lessons to be taken from the last 70 years, not just from China. Obviously, if you have limited targets and not every technology, that helps. If you have open access to funding, it's very transparent, and any company can essentially, from regardless whether they're American or not, can apply. That makes it a better competition for funding. If you are less prescriptive on the precise technological result, like if you want new energy vehicles, that makes sense, but if you say it's going to be hydrogen or it's going to be battery plug-in, that may be going too far. Let's allow the market to play some role in determining results. And if you can evaluate the outcomes and accountability, if a company gets money and they blow it, well, cut them off, right? I'm really worried that the folks down the street in Congress or even folks in the administration may not have the self-discipline needed to do this well, and that's why, the more humble, the better, I think. I don't want to go all the way to say we should be Taoist and do absolutely nothing. Washington is not a town that practices Taoism well, so we've got to do something. But just I think we'll get further with less ambition.
Miko-san.
Sure. So, of course, Japan and the United States will have tech competitions right now and also in the future. And I think that it's healthy for democratic countries to have competitions to offer better and reasonably priced technologies or solutions or products for our customers. But I think that things have really changed since the 1980s, since we had trade frictions between Japan and the United States. So Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came up with this great idea and concept, free and open Indo-Pacific. So right now, the like-minded countries pursue, of course, market share, but also we pursue and values the openness and freedoms. And I think that the more countries are getting this concept and appreciate the freedom and the openness and the market-driven competitiveness. That is why I think that the more countries, even in Europe, pursue free and open Indo-Pacific strategies. And even though that we still have competitions between the two countries or other like-minded countries, but I think that everybody's on the same page. The cybersecurity is important, and we have to share more cybersecurity intelligence for the better resiliency of the critical infrastructure and also supply chains. So that's where we can start our conversation, and that's where we can deepen and also expand our collaborations. And of course, we tend to only talk about China in terms of the economic security, but we also have to talk about other countries too, especially in terms of the cyber espionage. So the Finnish intelligence agency, SUPO or SUPO, published a National Security Overview 2022 2 months ago. And they said that because of the heavy sanctions on Russia, the country has been really struggling to get access to the Western technologies, and they are under pressures to substitute that kind of technologies. So they may go to more espionage activities in the future. And the Finnish intelligence agency, SUPO, called for more cybersecurity and data protections to Finnish companies. And I think it's also relevant warning to everybody in the like-minded countries.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay.
Kazeki-san?
Yeah. Let me go back to the subsidy issues to the Scott said and the subsidy war. Simple answer is that we don't want a subsidy war. Not at all. Yeah, actually, we like-minded countries should work on the same board. And for example, the U.S., Japan, sometimes complementary in the context of, like, for example, semiconductor. United States is very strong in design and, of course, semiconductor production in very precise nanometers. And Japan is very strong at the sort of, semiconductor manufacturing equipment as well as the materials and base materials. They are very good. So we are complementary. And, but at the same time, we need to address the sort of untransparent, unfair, non-market economy. So we have to differentiate with the such subsidies and our subsidies. So I really appreciate Scott's job. I remember I met Scott year 2007 in Geneva when I had negotiations on subsidy disciplines in the WTO. Yeah, in fact, last 15 years, you continue to work on these subsidy issues. It's amazing. And unfortunately, WTO disciplines were not achieved. But at the same time, there were dispute settlement mechanisms where we discussed the subsidy disciplines. So now it's lacking. So that is probably the issue. So we need a sort of a strong dispute settlement mechanism. It's now lacking due to the non-function, the appellate body. So first, we should restore the WTO, dispute settlement mechanism. That would be probably the very, very basis. And then we can differentiate the subsidies, non-market economy one, and more, I would say, friend-shoring one, transparent one. So that is my proposal to do in current, I think a U.S. initiative is very, very important to restore the function of the WTO.
Thank you. Jim, do you have a comment on this? Or?
No, you can move on.
All right. So one more question from me, and I'm known for putting two questions and calling it one. So maybe
that happened at the conference too.
All the time. And then I'll bring the audience for questions. And I'm going to ask Matsubara-san to take these questions first, but they're for everybody to join. And I'm going to frame it in terms of cybersecurity, but you can think how it applies to other areas that you're watching, supply chain and other issues. And, I think that we obviously continue to care about growth and innovation. And we're asking private corporations to deal with in a very challenging environment. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's coming. We know that we have increasing energy costs. We have uncertain rules of the game because, regulations keep changing. And we're also asking companies to absorb a lot of the cost of boosting their cyber security defenses. So I struggle to see how we're going to make progress on efficiency when there's so much added cost in terms of regulation and boosting defense capabilities and all of that. So if you can give us a sense of how you think the private sector is responding to that challenging environment. Question number one. Question number two, we've been talking about, I started this conversation, trends in the Indo-Pacific and implications for the U.S. I want to reverse that and ask your views on how the U.S. and Japan could make contributions to cyber security in the Indo-Pacific. So not just how they're affected by it, but how they can help shape the regional environment and improve it, hopefully.
Sure. So even before we started to talk about economic security and cybersecurity, there are always some people to argue that cybersecurity is a cost center and it's not an investment; it's just a cost center. So why we have to do this cybersecurity thing? But I think that gradually the perceptions amongst the business executives and also government leaders and also think tankers started to change their mindset. Because I think that because we've been seeing increasing cyber threats from different countries and also from different criminal groups, I think that we started to get because we are so much reliant on this digital infrastructure, and this is a foundation of everything. So that is why we have to care about cybersecurity, and we have to incorporate cybersecurity and embed it in the digital transformations. And also, I think that after Tokyo was selected to host the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games, I think it's a huge momentum and watershed moment for the Japanese. Like, okay, this is actually a great opportunity because we now have a set deadlines to accelerate our cybersecurity efforts, and we have to make sure that this will be the great event and successful and safe and secure. And because G7, as Kazuki-san already mentioned, as long as we have like a small step and small or big goals to achieve, then we can bring everybody together on the same page as a big teams to make sure that that event is successful, but also to take advantage of the legacies to enhance our national cybersecurity capabilities. And I think that Japan and the United States are placed really well to help the Indo-Pacific cybersecurity. So for example, lots of countries are very interested in Southeast Asia because it's such an attractive, growing market. But also, their cybersecurity can be really vulnerable. And both the Japanese government and the US government have been really helping the ASEAN countries' cybersecurity policy-making processes, and also to enhance the resiliency of their critical infrastructure companies over the last decade. So we already started to see some streamlined collaborative manners between the two countries to help the ASEAN, and we can also expand that kind of already arranged and framework into the bigger like-minded countries to help they enjoy and appreciate the better resiliency of critical infrastructure and cybersecurity.
Great. So because the audience has been very patient, if you have comments on the question I just asked, you can group them as we take also questions from the audience, both in person and online. So we have microphones, and when you get the mic here in the front, please, and this side, you can just identify yourself and ask a concise question. And I saw another hand here. I'll take two at a time, and I'll go to the center.
Thank you, Maria. I'm Ben Self of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. First of all, a wonderful panel. Thank you for hosting it, and congratulations on a really rich discussion and a great project. You mentioned strategic indispensability. Mm-hmm. It's a mouthful. But what Scott said was that neither the US nor China is really thinking that way. They're thinking much more about vulnerability. So I'm trying to figure out who's trying to assert their strategic indispensability, and to whom are they trying to be indispensable? And it seems to me it's Japan that's trying to be indispensable to China. Japan has a security alliance with the United States as an indispensable partner to the US already, but Japan has lost leverage to China over the decades. It used to be indispensable as a source of capital, investment, and technology, but clearly after China surpassed Japan's economy in 2010, China became much more arrogant in its attitude, and Japan seems to be groping for ways to restore some of its indispensability in that relationship. So my question is, especially to Scott, but any thoughts others of you have, is it working? Are the Chinese perceiving Japan as any more critical? Are they paying any more respect to the Japanese or thinking about Japan as an important partner, especially in terms of technology? Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And then we'll take one more question, and then I have some thoughts on that, but I want to hear from the panelists first. And if you can...
Hello, I'm Morgan, and I am from the Reischauer Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm a research fellow there. I wanted to look at the cybersecurity aspect of the basically PPP. Trying to, so I'll read the question I wrote. Sorry. Due to the potential of cyber cascade failure due to emerging technologies such as potential disruptive technologies and the priority that needs to be placed on the increased security in that area, how can we properly incentivize the private sector to prioritize increased security internationally?
Thank you very much. So 2 questions, strategic indispensability, who practices it or who doesn't, and how is Japan seen in that light, and then the cybersecurity question. So who would like to And then I want to.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. Ben, thanks for the question. Obviously, I mean, I think even though it's not part of the U.S. language, we actually practice it, right? We are thrilled everyone uses the dollar. We are thrilled everyone sends their students here to learn and do research. These are huge strategic assets to us. And I think we've had a conversation, I know Brookings and CSIS and others, about the competition over attracting talent, which is part of the indispensability of our system. You think of NIH and all the research that we do around healthcare and things like that. These are strategic assets that we can use. You don't typically, when you've got a strategic asset like that, open your coat and go, if you don't act properly, you're going to lose all these things and show your weaponry. It's known, right? And there's voluntary compliance. That's when you really know that it's working, when you don't have to show the weapons. When I was in the region, this came across to me mostly, I heard it everywhere, but most clearly in Taiwan, right? 42% of Taiwan's exports go to mainland China or Hong Kong, 26% of Korea's, 22% of Japan's. Everybody is going to have a relationship with China. U.S. is 8.6%, right? So the U.S. is the one having the conversation about, do we radically reduce this relationship or not? Others, you can't do that. I mean, it's your largest trading partner, destination for foreign investment, et cetera. So they're saying, what can we do to make sure this relationship stays reasonably balanced and we aren't disrespected, et cetera. And in the case of Taiwan, they know that semiconductor manufacturing is what they've got. 65% of advanced chip manufacturing, 90% of the market overall. The world depends on them. And as Taiwan's representative to Washington, B. Kim Xiao, says repeatedly, we want people to see this as that we are strategically relevant and that this technology is indispensable as long as you can perceive. So although the Taiwanese have been made agreements to invest in fab capacity here, they're actually expanding fab capacity at 10 times the rate that they're investing anywhere abroad. And so that to them is a critical source of their security. Does it guarantee anything? Absolutely not. But on balance, they think it does. Now, of course, they also have to look for other technologies of the future. 10, 15 years down the road, pure play fabs may not be as important as they are today. So is it going to be in energy? Is it going to be in other types of semiconductor space or something else? What is indispensable today in 15 years may become relatively irrelevant or a cheap commodity that you can set up any place, So I see that now. That may be trying to create something out of nothing or on the defensive, but it is a more forward-looking vision. And for those that specialize in something that is very important that the rest of the world needs, it's not a dumb strategy. I think the U.S., I don't think we're aware of the strategic leverage that we have until it starts to become part of the conversation. And so we might want to go back to our roots and remember how powerful we are without really needing to change much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kazaki-san.
Yeah, well, the Ben's question is quite relevant. My answer is that it is, of course, from Japan too, strategic indispensability. I reflect or recall the 1 or 2 years ago, we started this one, strategic autonomy and indispensability. And I agree, Scott, that it's a more forward-looking approach. So we tend to think about internally the vulnerabilities or weakness when we experience the rare earth shock in the year 2010. After that, we already think about internal risks or vulnerabilities, weakness, and then forward money. So that's it. But since I think 2020, 2021, we started to think about more positively to be strong. Yeah, and Japan should be the indispensable country. And in the past, of course, we are very good at, for example, materials or machine tools already. And but of course, they are catching up from other countries. So indispensable for all countries, not only you said China, but also the United States too. We need to be the indispensable for all. So that is a more sort of encouraging concept for the Japanese communities. So that is my answer to you.
Thank you. And because time is running fast, I'll reserve my comments for the coffee afterwards. But we have a question from the audience online, and then there was a question here from someone in the center. So if you want to bring, please, mic to him. And in the meantime, this question comes from Colin Craig, who's a grad student at Georgetown University. And I thought it was very relevant because, you know, the tone of this conversation, and very quickly when you bring economic security, is about unbridled competition or zero sum or mirror images of who started this and, you know, no clear off ramps. And Craig is asking, how can we have all this competition but still preserve peaceful and stable relationship with China? How do we continue to have, let's not break the engine of growth in the region, if you will. So this is indeed a very tall order given the current climate. But where can we be more optimistic of some areas where there could be some constructive economic area of cooperation with China, or non-economic on other areas as well?
Just to venture into that briefly, or do you want to get the other question first?
Well, maybe for the sake of time.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Sasakawa, and I'm a diplomatic trainee from Japan, currently studying at Georgetown University. I have a question regarding the U.S. commitment to the multilateral trading system. So, Kazakhstan, you mentioned the importance of the WTO dispute settlement system, but the impasse of the appellate body hasn't been solved even under the Biden administration. And in fact, the Biden's national security strategy didn't even mention WTO, whereas Trump's and also Obama's NSS mentioned WTO at least once somewhere. So how can we re-engage U.S. to the multilateral trading system? What is the role of allies in this respect? Thank you.
Two great questions. Jim, why don't you get started?
Sure. Well, in terms of how do we approach this competition with China, I think the short answer is you do as little as possible. Or as little as necessary. You know, the Asia-Pacific strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy talks a lot about, in the U.S., talks a lot about a positive vision for the region and for U.S. and allied cooperation in this regard. And I think this connects to your question earlier about kind of regional capacity building and how the region fits into this, the things that the U.S. and Japan are doing, whether it's cybersecurity capacity building in the region, but also we have the Commerce-METI dialogue on JUSIP and energy and digital connectivity, things that are contributing more broadly to openness and connectivity. At the same time, every once in a while, drawing a line in the sand or protecting something that we think is absolutely vital. And then the economic 2+2 is there to help us and allies, us and Japan, and other forums that we have with other allies to figure out where these kind of circles or lines get drawn. But the fundamental approach, I think, should be to do as little as necessary so that we don't just simply cascade into that kind of unbridled competition. I don't think that's in our interest long term.
Scott?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Jim just said. I would say, with regard to the export control side of things, clarity and certainty matters a lot. So one of the things about the October 7th document is that it's 150-some pages. So that's very clear. But it may be so clear that, I mean, it's really long. So the concept that the administration cites is small yard, high fence. So you have to imagine that this is a small yard with a very, 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 very high fence. To get to 160 pages. Will that be what it is in 5 years? What can give companies around the world clarity about the trajectory of these rules? And there's been rumors that they're going to come out with something similar for other industries. It'd be good if they were clear about that, recognizing all the things about NDAs and everything Jim said before, that if there's no clarity, then it is really unbridled competition. I think, in addition, on the supply chain side of things, is there a role for China in global supply chain resilience? If you took Chinese producers out of the equation of PPE and healthcare supplies right now, where would we be? And just think about that in other sectors. Obviously, there's some elements that you want to build outside China so that they don't need to be part of the solution. In fact, they're the part of the problem. But is there any sectors where production in China helps us get across some pandemic or global crisis or hazard or something like that? So I think all of these aren't just about one barrier down the world, China against everyone else. I think in different sectors, different technologies, we're going to have a more complex answer set.
Great. Very short comments, 30 seconds each.
Yeah, very short comment on communication with China. It's very important to have a predictability. Even Japan is trying to have a very good communication with China. And also, I hope that it should be done multilaterally too, US, Japan, China, or even EU. So that is the ultimate goal. We can discuss the predictability, transparency. And I agree with Scott. Of course, 150 pages is very clear, but actual practice is a different story. So therefore, we do our best to do or clarify with business communities. So that is the point. And second question, you guys, well, it's very important, but my hope is that we need to think about a very creative idea because still panel level discussions are ongoing, only the appellate body issue. So I hope we all together think about new approach to reform the WTO appellate body system. And also interim agreement, multi-parties interim agreement is there, but the US and Japan are not a party. So at least we should join, but that's my personal opinion. Still, it's a very political, I would say, obstacle here. And of course, we have to engage in WTO negotiations. But first, at least a minimum, such kind of arbitration system is a must in order to move forward.
Great. Yeah, Miko-san?
So I'd like to answer the question from Morgan about cybersecurity. So unfortunately, there's no one specific silver bullet to incentivize all the companies in the world simultaneously, because bigger companies have more budget to invest in cybersecurity versus smaller companies have less resources to invest in cybersecurity. So what do we do that? So actually the Japanese local governments and Japanese companies have came up with a really creative, very Japanese way to solve this problem. Manga. Because manga can visualize what kind of threats you are facing and what kind of solutions you can take at a reasonable cost. And also, I think you also have to take a grassroots level of efforts to reach out to smaller companies in each regions. And the Japanese police started to create economic security task force to talk to the business executives in the companies and also business associations to share best practices and also the specific examples. So I think that these kind of efforts will be relevant to other countries, including the United States.
Very interesting. Jim, last words go to you to close the session today.
Well, no, I just want to thank you for, and I'll let you thank the whole panel and do the official thing, but partnering with us for this event, it's terrific to help us expand the reach of the Next Alliance initiative, your contributions over the past weekend, and I look forward to continuing this discussion because there's a lot more. We'll have follow-on papers coming out. We'll be publishing products from this initiative, but this is an ongoing challenge.
Well, my thanks to you as well, and to all the panelists. Please join me in thanking them.